In this episode, I host a conversation between Dr. Michael Sheehy, Dr. Tawni Tidwell, and Dr. Julian Schott. Dr. Michael Sheehy is the Director of Research at the Contemplative Sciences Center in the Department of Religious Studies in the University of Virginia. Dr. Tawni Tidwell is a biocultural anthropologist and Doctor of Traditional Tibetan Medicine. Dr. Julian Schott is an Indologist, Tibetologist, and Assistant Professor at the University of Vienna. This trialogue is part of a series exploring the latest interdisciplinary research into tantric completion stage practices such as yogas of dream, sleep, and death. Dr. Sheehy shares his cutting-edge research into these techniques, reveals the implication of new directions in neuroscience and micro-phenomenology, and warns of the danger of esoteric practices becoming extinct. Dr. Sheehy also proposes a two-way split in the future of religious practice. Dr. Tidwell reflects on the decline in the number of spiritual masters, and Dr. Schott considers the real meaning of secrecy in Tibetan tantra. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Sheehy, Dr. Tawni Tidwell, and Dr. Julian Schott. Michael Sheehy, Tawni Tidwell, and Julian Schott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Steve.
Happy to be back.
Well, I'm so delighted to have the three of you here. Wow. I was saying before we began, what a dream team. And in more ways than one. First of all, there's the three of you here. And then second of all, our topic today is about dream and sleep. And this is part of a short series that we have planned, looking at various completion stage practices and their intersection with interdisciplinary research, neuroscience and that sort of thing. And this is an area in which all three of you are very fruitfully involved. So today we're going to focus on dream and sleep, and in the next installment we will focus on death and dying. And beyond that, who knows? But those are the ones we have planned for the time being. So thanks once again to all three of you for coming here. So dream and sleep. Michael, I'm wondering if you might talk a bit about some of the fascinating dream yoga research you've been involved with, and also, if you would, perhaps give us a sense of the state of play overall of dream yoga, lucid dreaming knowledge and research as far as you see it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So, the orientation of this conversation is really Tibetan Buddhism and Indian Buddhism. So within that sort of broad continuity of traditions, there's different kinds of contemplative sleep practices. So in general, in Tibetan, we say nyalgom, which just literally means sleep meditation. But within sleep meditation, there's different kinds, and the two main practices that have sort of historically developed are, on the one case, what we call dream yoga, which I'll talk about, but it's essentially a lucid dreaming practice that engages distinct contemplative techniques. And then the second one is called clear light at night. And those are practices of inducing and sustaining clear light while asleep. That is to say, dreamless sleep. And we can talk about that as well. On the dream yoga side is where our research is these days, although I've been doing some work on the clear light materials within the Tibetan tradition. And there's meditation manuals within Tibetan on all of these that are quite extraordinary and quite elaborate. Over the last several years, we've had this study, two studies really emerge. One is an interdisciplinary study that brings adept practitioners of dream yoga into sleep lab with our partners at Northwestern University at Ken Powler Sleep Lab, the Powler Sleep Lab. And we're interested in monitoring their brain waves, their heartbeats, the respiratory signals. And we do so by bringing them into the sleep lab, hooking them up, kind of going through this protocol that initiates auditory sounds that are played to cue moments of lucidity for the dreamer. So if we're going to talk about lucid dreaming, what we mean is while asleep in the state of a dream, being aware that you're in a dream. And this is something that really the pioneer of lucid dreaming science, Stephen LaBerge, defined lucid dreaming as such, being awake while in a dream. But it's also the classic definition we find in these Tibetan Buddhist meditation manuals, of which the first stage of dream yoga is what they call recognition. And recognition is recognizing the dream as a dream while you're dreaming. So it's, I think, important to note that lucid dreaming in both contexts is defined as the same thing. Anyways, so we cue these moments of lucidity in the lab with auditory sounds, as I mentioned. And then those cues, those sounds, are meant to induce moments when the dream yoga practitioner performs a contemplative task. And I'll talk about those. There's a classic set of 6 contemplative practices that you perform, but then there's other renditions of that, longer ones and abbreviated, etc. Mostly we try to talk with the dreamer before they fall asleep about which practice or so-called contemplative task that they'll perform while they're lucid. The dreamers trained before they go into sleep to then signal the completion of this task, this performing this dream yoga practice, by the movement of their eyeballs left and right without blinking. So their eyes are closed and they're moving their eye left and right. And when they're asleep and they're hooked up to the EEG with the, the respiration and HRV monitor and so forth, we can monitor the eye movements back and forth, which is different than the blink. And those are very intentional eye movements that the lucid dreamer can make that signals those exact moments in the lucid dream state when they're performing that task. We can then correlate that directly, of course, to all the neurophysiological data, their brain waves, their heart rate at that millisecond, right? Down to the millisecond. What this also enables, just to sort of state the obvious of what I just said, is when we're doing that, we are opening a channel of two-way communication between the dreamer and the person in the lab. So we're opening channels and actually communicating with people while in their dream states. They're cueing, again, with this eyeball movement, the performance and completion of a contemplative task based on this preset formula from the classical manuals. So we have this kind of protocol that enables this real-time, two-way communication during dream experiences, which is pretty incredible. The dream sessions are then followed up with micro-phenomenological interviews. One of the things, I'm sort of standing up a lab here and research outfit here at the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. And one of the things that we're deeply invested in, as well as the neurobiological measures, is phenomenology. And by that, I mean rigorous methods to unveil, elicit, and describe first-person experience down to the micro gestures, down to precise movements of their mind, of sensation, etc. Right? So after they wake up and come out of these dreams, they then go right into a micro-phenomenological interview that's pre-scheduled with a trained micro-phenomenologist who actually specializes in dreams, and recount the practices and the tasks that they performed in dream time. So then we have descriptive accounts from the dreamers you know, sometimes minutes, sometimes longer hours after they performed it in the dream state. So you see now we're building a picture here. We have, on the one hand, these classical descriptions and prescriptions from the dream yoga manuals, and I can talk about them, but from the 11th century onwards, within the Tibetan tradition, we have these manuals that prescribe how to perform these dream yoga practices. So we're reading those, we're translating them, we're bringing them to life then we're operationalizing them with people who are familiar with this practice, with expert practitioners in the lab setting so that we can monitor what happens with their brain waves, their heart rate, and the respiration, as I mentioned. So we get these kind of neurobiological measures in real time through this two-way communication, again, through the cues while they're lucid in the dream, performing these classic dream yoga tasks. They wake up, we then ask them about it in this not just casual manner, but in a kind of rigorous protocol that invites and elicits a detailed descriptive phenomenology of that experience, what they were doing the moment before, what prompted them. Did they hear the sound? What did the sound like? Do they remember moving their eyeballs? What was the experience of performing the task? Did they feel something happen after the task, et cetera, et cetera? And as we all know, dreams are unpredictable spaces. So all kinds of surprises arise, right? I know I'm speaking now as though this is very linear and very kind of scientific, which it is on one level. And yet we're also talking about being in a dream space. And as those of us who have dreams, which is not everyone, but a large percentage of the human population dream, that those dreams are unpredictable spaces. They're spaces where the surprise is recurrent, right? Where we may think something's going to happen, but something else entirely different happens, etc. So again, the phenomenology is meant to allow a kind of rich description of that. So in this way, we're kind of piecing together this kind of triangular methodology of classical descriptions of these dream yoga practices and the prescriptive operationalization of those, looking at the Tibetan literary tradition and the living tradition. Second, what happens within the brain and the body that we can detect, that we can measure within the lab. And then third, how do people talk about their experience? How do they describe it? Give it their own language, their own descriptive, animation of their dream. So in this way, this kind of threefold methodology is piecing together what we hope will be a kind of characterization of a profile of dream yoga practitioners that, has the historical, the kind of neurophysiological, and the phenomenological mapped over each other. We can talk about this, and I'd love to hear Tawni's thoughts on this. Of course, there's all sorts of riddles with that kind of methodological overlap and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, this is the kind of research that we're undertaking.
Can I also just ask you, Michael, to just maybe for listeners too, to give a framework also for what's at stake for the science? And I know that Ken Paller was really interested in kind of amnesiacs and memories too. So maybe just a frame at his interest and the team's interest in some of the questions that are being pursued.
Yeah, so we've so that's the first study, and I can talk about the second study, which also has kind of takes it in a different direction, has different kind of generalizable applications. What we're looking for across these practices is one, an understanding of lucidity. And what do I mean by lucidity? I mean, as I described earlier, actually being aware that you're aware in whatever state you're in. And that sounds very simple, almost simplistically obvious that we're aware, but are we? And to what extent are we aware? You know, there's some interesting measures these days around mind wandering and attention, and over 90% of our attention is not task oriented. That is to say, it's not exactly we're aware of what we think we're aware of, right? We're actually drifting in all sorts of ways, and that's fine. And yet, what would it be like, not in an effortful way, but actually in an effortless way, to have a sustained lucidity, a sustained awareness of what's happening within our mind, our body, etc. So one of the measures is meta-awareness, which is awareness of the contents of the undercurrents of consciousness. And when we look at meta-awareness scales, we can look at levels of degrees of what we're aware of within the so-called contents of awareness. And what I mean by that is simply, what are we feeling? What are we sensing? What are we thinking? What are we perceiving? What are we, you know, what are our emotions, etc. And so that's one level, or really kind of two that are complementary: lucidity and degrees of meta-awareness. And then we look at three other things that I've sort of pulled from the Tibetan meditation manuals, the dream yoga manuals, and sort of translated, if you will, try to characterize in contemporary psychological parlance. And the first is psychological flexibility, which is the ability to move one's mind in ways that one hadn't habitually been oriented to move. So it involves perspective shifting, perspective taking, imagining new scenarios, which is actually drifts into this second feature, first being psychological flexibility, which is more than cognitive flexibility, I'll say, which is another term out there, but it's inclusive of that. And then the second is imagination, or what I call imaginal simulation, where you're actually mobilizing your capacity to imagine new scenarios, new possibilities in ways that resituate your sense of self, and your sense of and your orientation to a scenario in new ways. So we find this throughout the dream yoga manuals. We find it in other contemplative practice techniques as well. But simply, you know, what is it to constantly imagine oneself differently, and to do that intentionally, so that that very process and act of imaginal simulation has the effect of changing oneself, of altering one's perceptions, of altering one's cognitions, how one thinks and reacts and perceives, etc. And then the third is somatic awareness. And I know that may seem sort of disconnected because we're talking about dreams, which of course are very abstract and cerebral in some sense. And yet, when we look at the manuals, when we look at the prescriptions from these classical literature, and then we look at the practices and how they're oriented, they're very much oriented around the body and what gets called the dream body in the dream world. So just as we have our ordinary waking body and our ordinary waking world, and we have a kind of mind-body world model that we move in our world and we operate in our world. You know, I can sort of reach out so far and I can stand so high, and my eyes always look forward, although I can tilt my head at sort of 90 degrees, but I can never see behind me, and etc. Right? We have an orientation, right? A kind of body scheme in the world. And that sort of delimits our perceptions and actually our sensations and so on and so forth. And we become deeply habituated according to that orientation of our body in the world. In the same way, these traditions say and prescribe that we become deeply habituated as dream bodies in dream worlds. And yet, if we take these practices on, that is to say, if we choose to practice something like dream yoga, then part of the practice is because it's in a dream and the laws of nature are different, gravity doesn't operate the same way, the body can do things it can't do in the ordinary world. Things can appear and disappear in ways that they cannot in the dream. Temporality is shifted, et cetera, et cetera. Because we're not in the ordinary world, the body can do different things. The body can move differently. So there's practices of walking diagonally. There's practices of walking backwards, but feeling like you're moving forwards. There's practices of walking completely sideways. And then, of course, transcending boundaries, walls, doors, windows, flying. Of course, everyone loves to fly, and why not? So do I. And levitate and et cetera, et cetera. So you see that we don't have those ordinary confines in the dream world. Therefore, these practices leverage those possibilities. So all of that is to say, again, on this third feature of somatic awareness, we're very interested in how that changes a sense and awareness of embodiment. So we're interested in if those practices are performed during dreaming and people are lucid or have heightened lucidity, are aware that they're performing them in the dream world, when they wake, are those felt senses, are those features translated into the waking experience? And how so? What are the kind of empirical measures for that? When it comes to perception, when it comes to cognition, when it comes to body boundary, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a kind of, a set of measures that we're looking at things like perception, cognition, and body boundaries and body awareness around psychological flexibility, imaginal simulation, and somatic awareness.
Could I ask you something? You were kind of anticipating in your last sentences already my question, because I think one of the very interesting points in these practices is precisely as you say, what is the sense of impact it has on your daily life experiences? I mean, thinking about that these practitioners who would do these practices complementary to their, let's say, awaking practices, do you have any sense of, I mean, for instance, in terms of your phenomenological interviews, any sense of in which way these alters or advances practices or simple forms of perception of these practitioners in a daily state? I mean, like we have this famous sentences in Buddhism, you know, like since its conception, life is basically to be perceived as a dreamlike illusion, the city of Gandharvas, whatever, you name it, these famous examples. So I would imagine that these practices should contribute to some kind of stronger sense of experience in terms of having an actual feeling what this kind of metaphors might mean for an, let's say, daily experience of an ordinary human being. I mean, is this part of your interviews, or do you have any form of long-term studies in that regard?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Julian. So you're right. There's a classic set of 6 and sometimes 9, and there's also a set of 12. There's different enumerations of similes that we find from certainly Mahayana Buddhism, the Prajnaparamitas. They're all over these kind of transcendent wisdom sutras at the turn of the millennia, the turn of the first millennia, when Mahayana Buddhism was on the rise. And we have earlier citations in the suttas, the Pali suttas, etc. And by the time you get to sort of late Indian Buddhism, and by the time things get to Tibet, by the mid 11th century and onwards, when these practices are translated into Tibetan, these similes of reality, like a dream, like an illusion, like the city of Gandharvas, like a bubble, like an echo, etc. This practice of dream yoga takes very serious. They say, okay, what if we were to really take it seriously as an exercise, as a contemplative exercise, that life is like a dream, that is not just a philosophical illusion, but for emptiness and the insubstantiality of reality and the kind of fleeting perceptual instances. But let's actually fall asleep and dream and practice in our dreams. And so there's a whole technique that developed called dream yoga that does that, as we're discussing. And the claim, of course, from the traditions, the kind of implicit understanding that is that a practitioner of dream yoga performs the dream like performs these practices in a dream world so that those dream-like experiences are translated into their ordinary waking life. What comes along with that, in this very elegant manner, is a set of daytime practices, which I call lucid waking. The technical term is gyulu, and that means illusory form practices, or sometimes illusory body practices. And these illusory form practices or lucid waking practices are imaginal practices that you practice while you're awake. And there's different sets of them and prescriptions for how to practice, but they often involve two kinds of general kinds of practices. One is imaginal practices, very much imagining things in new ways. We can talk about that, but exercising this imaginal simulation that I talked about earlier. And the second is by observing how ordinary, everyday perceptions are illusory. One of my favorite examples, and comes from a text I translated, and from the 14th century, dream yoga and sort of lucid waking practice, where he says, wake up early in the morning or go out just before dawn. So dawn or dusk, or just before dusk rather, or just before dawn, sorry. And go out, particularly if the season is changing, to a place where they have some trees. And don't look up at the trees too much, just look down at the floor. And look at the floor, and as the wind shimmers across with the breeze and the trees, look at the patterns on the ground of the leaves. And think to yourself, how could this be real? How is what I'm perceiving fixed or substantial? How is what I'm perceiving real? So they talk about, cracks of light and moments of drift and subtle movements that are of shadows that are part of our ordinary waking life, but that we're not necessarily observant of. And attuning to those, and as we attune to those, thinking to ourselves, oh, that's just like a dream. How could that be real? Because it feels so fleeting and unreal and insubstantial. So anyways, you have this kind of complementary set of lucid waking practices, daytime practices, diurnal practices. And then you fall asleep and then you practice in your dream, these lucid dreaming practices, right? The nocturnal practices. So in this way, the whole kind of curriculum of this particular practice is just twofold, what they call the cycle of day and night. That is to say, while you're awake, you're practicing these imaginal simulations and observations of the fleeting nature of reality, the flickerings and the transience and the kind of luminescent liminal experiences. And then you fall asleep, and as you go into dream, you perform in ways and that you're not bound by in ordinary waking life, to kind of exaggerate your imagination, to conjure things that are not there, to multiply one thing into many, to many things, and to one again, to take purple things and turn them red, and yellow things to turn them purple, etc., etc. So there's these different gestures or contemplative practices of conjuring, of transforming, of multiplying, etc. That is all working with one's abilities to kind of, again, be psychologically flexible and to exercise imagination or these kind of imaginal capacities. And then again, waking up and thinking, okay, what was that like? How did that feel? And then translating that into ordinary waking perceptions and cognitions. The trick here is not to think that reality is an illusion. And they say this over and over again. That would be potentially devastating psychologically. They said instead, that's the trap of nihilism, right? Of nihilism. Instead, they say, keep it as a simile. Keep it as an analog. Remember, your experience is your experience, however it is. And these are like a dream. Your experience is like an illusion. I think that's a very important thing. So yeah.
Michael, I feel like it's such a exciting program of research. I think that in many ways you could hear the program and think it's quite esoteric. And yet I feel like there's so much at stake for contemplative science as a field of research that you guys are developing in terms of the techniques, in terms of the partnership with your practitioners, that this is a research that could in many ways only be done with adepts to develop a lot of this ability to report, right? That they have the awareness of the experience in the state to be able to report, that you have also in many ways an opportunity to train them to report at levels that they may never have trained in their actual lucid dreaming practices, in terms of training them to move their eyes, training them to, key into certain kinds of tones, although some traditions might be doing that, or some teachers. But I think it gets to aspects that we've seen in terms of default network practices, right? Where you're seeing, do you interrupt a practice by having them actually provide markers of their experience, right?
Yeah.
And that I think can inform how we look at novice practitioners who have never meditated, how we ask them to think about where their body is, how their breath is, how their experience is through these elicitations of the micro-phenomenological interviews. So I'm curious, in your work, at least with this study, how much do you find that the practitioners themselves actually experience greater resolution in their lucid dreaming, greater ability to engage those practices just because of your paradigm, right? Your protocol.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Okay, so two things come to mind. One, amongst this relatively small set of practitioners who we've been looking at, but it's frankly a small data set, right? It's a small sample size, so I can't really make too many generalizations. But we do find, I think, both with the two-way communication of dreamers while they're in the dream state, as well as the micro-phenomenological interviews, those are two ways that even these, experienced dream yoga practitioners feel that they've been given new ways to sort of amplify their practices and also unveil dimensions and articulations of their experience that were otherwise reflective and not at the surface of articulation and expression. And I think that's sort of kind of the power of the practice. It's actually the sort of practice of research, if you will, right? At best, as researchers, what we're also doing, at least in the space of contemplative research, is also providing ways for practitioners to recognize and bring forth through expressions and through our measurements of these practices that hadn't otherwise been articulated. The second thing I want to say here, and this is now sort of onto our second study, which is what we're ramping up now. So that was the sort of study A, and now study B, also in partnership with the Paller Lab at Northwestern, as well as Anuma virtual reality, which we're partnered with to develop a virtual reality simulation of these practices. So we're now in the kind of early stages of designing. I've sort of been scoping out actually just over the last few weeks, and we're going to do design sessions through the summer and start to run some pilots in the fall around a kind of virtual reality experience that simulates these features and these practices of dream yoga. So working with these kind of immersive and transformative technologies is very powerful, coupled with contemplative practices in general. And I'm actually working with a few different design processes to bring contemplative practices into virtual reality, into virtuality. This is one of them. And I think it's interesting because this coupling of these dream yoga or contemplative lucid dreaming practices with virtual reality meditation designed to simulate these experiences, but also to understand how dreaming may kind of hold a key to overcoming the tacit assumptions that guide people's waking lives, right? To kind of unveil and kind of process of discovery and make explicit these operations of cognition and perception and sensation, how we move and think in the world in ordinarily habitual ways. So it kind of supports the transformation of these ordinary habits of perception and cognition, but through this kind of powerful platform that you can just put on your head. You know, if you have a headset and the internet, the VR experiences that we're designing are a kind of, at least a kind of training wheels to ramp people up into a familiarization and cultivation of contemplative life skills by performing these specific contemplative tasks, in this case from the dream yoga practice tradition, while lucid in a dream-like, interactive, immersive virtual reality, right? So we can work with people while they're awake in virtual reality to simulate these kind of features of experience and have them go through this kind of performance of these exercises, a kind of mimicry of what it's like to be lucid in a dream world, performing these kind of classic sets of dream yoga practices. And we hope that that is generalizable, that then these practices, you don't have to be an expert lucid dream practitioner, you don't have to be a dream yoga practitioner, but the principles and the processes of these practices are recontextualized in a kind of virtual reality practice that we think has broad applications. So much to say about that, but that's how, so in thinking about like sort of the kind of historical frameworks for these practices into the neuroscientific understanding of them, into the translation of real world applications, you can see the kind of arc there, right?
And I can also see the remarkable intersections with psychedelic research, right? How do we intersect and reframe our understanding of reality, our sense of self, possibilities? It's really exciting.
Yeah, no, psychedelics, and we have a group here, a collaborative at the University of Virginia. I know you have one as well, and Wisconsin and major universities around the world are looking at this in psychedelic research and interventions. I will say though, there's lots of parallels and there's lots to be said about it. In fact, there's some interesting studies around effects of virtual reality experience with psychedelics that we are very keen to, particularly with the virtual reality aesthetic that we use, which is a kind of alternative aesthetic. We're not just mimicking so-called in real life, objects and people with avatars and environments and so forth, but we have this Enuma, it's called a pneumodelic aesthetic, is a kind of alternative space. So it's already operating in a sort of different perceptual plane and orientation. And it's been found, there's now some interesting studies coming out around the analogs of effects with psychedelics and virtual reality. And I think, of course, when we look at practices like these very elaborate and rich imaginal practices, and then we provide supports through virtual reality, I think we're going to find some interesting analogs with what's happening in the psychedelics world. I also just, it's key that these interventions are not do not require the prescription of psychoactives, right? So that enables us to even have more general prescriptions and applications. We can work with populations more broadly, prospectively, and so on and so forth. So we're also trying to leverage not just having experiences, but having experiences that provide openings that then are complemented with practices, right? So I know I'm talking a lot here, but in the Tibetan tradition, there's two ways that we frame that contemplation or contemplative practices, or contemplation, if I may, is framed. One is practices, and we always talk about contemplative practices, and rightly so. And dream yoga is a contemplative practice, a contemplative sleep practice in particular. And what do we mean by practice? It's something that you perform intentionally as a training over time to transform the mind, the body, the self, perception, orientation, relationships, etc., whatever it may be. It's a training that's very intentional around deep familiarization of the kinds of qualities that practice is designed to cultivate. The other approach to contemplation is not about practices, but about experiences. And experiences are things that we're having all the time. I mean, we're all experiencing all the time in different ways. And yet, if we curate the conditions, the social, the environmental, the imaginal, the cosmological, ecological, ethical, et cetera, the context, if we curate these contexts and conditions to induce certain kinds of experiences, then that's another kind of contemplation. Let me give you just a quick example that I use. My kids love to ride roller coasters. We go to the park in the summer, and they want to get a roller coaster, and they want to go on, they're teenagers now. They want to go on the biggest, baddest, wildest roller coaster. Why do they want to do that? Because if they get on the roller coaster and they strap in, they don't have to do much else, and yet they know they're going to have a kind of experience, right? So and psychedelics are kind of like that. You provide this kind of context, you take your dosage, and you're going to have some kind of experience. How you navigate it, what are the outcomes, what is the integration, all left open. Same for a roller coaster ride. But nonetheless, you know you're going to have a different kind of experience. Minimally, we can say that. Okay? So this is curating conditions, and there's all kinds of examples of that. So that's a very particular kind of approach, the approach of curation. These traditions say if you just curate the conditions for the emergence of transformative experiences, you're not going to have the deep integration. You have to couple it then with the practices. They said actually having those experiences is very important, very, can be transformative, those openings. And yet, if it's not coupled with some kind of training, with some kind of practice that people learn, that people build skill sets and competencies around, then those openings, those experiences that were curated for transformation fade. They're not deeply part of the person. Maybe they can elicit them via memory, they can recall them with fondness and so forth, but they're not shape-shifting their perceptions. They're not deeply integrated into their behavior. They're not who they are in their waking ordinary life. So therefore, there's this kind of difference I just really want to point out with when we're talking about contemplative practices and the psychedelic research. And we're actually on the psychedelic side, we're sort of actually looking at, well, then how can trainings, particularly contemplative trainings, be coupled with psychedelic experiences? Actually, we have a group paper coming out. It's well developed now that prescribes some couplings of different families and styles of practices with different substances and so forth.
And I love how also, though, the Enuma, particularly the study B, provides an opportunity to generate hypotheses that could be tested in a psychedelic research program framework, right? To say, how do we understand and engage our experience? How do people report back on those kinds of experiences? And then how do they integrate it? What are the practices that they develop or don't develop in their waking life or in their out of intervention life to actually post practice or post intervention experience that? And I think it's such a power. I mean, people ask me all the time, why doesn't Tibetan medicine have psychedelics, right? Why are there not psychotropics like we see in so many different traditional medical systems? And my response is often that the practices themselves are enough to transform reality, and that and the knowledge that those kind of transformations require a sustainability and that integration piece, right? That the experiences themselves are not powerful enough to change behavior, to change perception, to change cognition. So, yeah, really exciting.
Yeah, no, well put, Tawni. So one of the dynamics that I'm very interested in looking at as we develop more and more virtual reality meditations, the lucid dreaming or dream yoga is one. We have a kind of suite of practices that we're designing, is looking at people who only practice in the VR, people who practice the same practices outside of the VR, that is to say, just on their own in a kind of classical terms, in real life, so to speak. And then what I'm interested in is then the coupling, that is to say, or the so-called toggling back and forth. So anyways, we can talk about research design, but one of the things I'm very interested in is what I call the toggle effect. That is to say, how can we use the induction and curation of contemplative openings to be enhanced through training programs that are deeply integrated in one's waking ordinary life? And I think that there's a kind of toggle effect that enables that.
This also reminds me of like a contemporary version of our meditation supports, right? Thangkas, statues, mandalas, right? And it's bringing that to life for people. I mean, now you have these video simulations that have been beautifully created by so many sanghas, so many teachers to help people to have pure perception, to have that realization of the illusory experience of our reality and how to break those boundaries of our own mind for the imaginal realizations and reckonings.
Yeah, it's a powerful approach. I know, it's not exactly there's a kind of conservative approach to these practices, which won't prescribe this kind of coupling of transformative and immersive technologies. And yet, if we think about some of the things we do in our life when we were growing up, like riding a bike, just hopping on a bike and sort of being pushed down the road or down your driveway or something, the first time you're going to fall off if you don't have training wheels, pretty much. If not, it's pretty remarkable. And yet, if you have training wheels, and you'll wobble side to side and you'll jerk your handlebars and you'll move your pedals and you'll get a sense of like, oh, whoa, whoa, and maybe you'll fall over or maybe you'll hit something, etc. But nonetheless, you get this wobble feel of like, oh, what is it to move through space? What is this kind of velocity like on this metal apparatus traversing at a speed that I'm not ordinarily moving at, and this kind of balancing act that's abnormal. And yet, when you do that a few times with these training wheels, with these stabilizers of your balance and your speed, then eventually you become familiar with what it is to traverse through space at that speed and the velocity and balance yourself on that kind of awkward apparatus called the bike. And you don't need them anymore. And in the same way, I am very curious how we can use, and this is what we're experimenting with in this lab called the Contemplative Innovation and Research Collaboratorium here at UVA, is how we can use different technologies to support an on-ramp, if you will, as kind of training wheels into contemplative experiences and contemplative felt sense of what it is to be familiar with these kinds of experiences.
And do you guys have guides in terms of lamas or rinpoches or kind of sanghas that are guiding some of this development? Or
yeah, no, we're in constant conversation with Tibetans, so we have this kind of deep interdisciplinary approach where we're bringing people from different expertise and including, all sorts of people from within the tradition. That's a whole thing into itself. And yeah, that's a whole episode.
To that, actually, here's a question. So one of the things I notice about your description is you're using in that first study traditional dream yoga practice techniques from the manuals, from the textual and practice tradition. And that's quite interesting. That's bringing that into a sort of neuroscience context is a quite interesting move, I think. And if I might be Mara's advocate, sort of devil's advocate, but Mara's version, for a moment, on the one hand, some people might approach, I think there has been an approach at times, looking at these sort of categories, these textual and practice categories, and saying, well, they're perhaps a bit superstitious, a bit imprecise, a bit too culturally, maybe even mythical in a sense, and so they're not tractable for scientific study. So
in doing contemplative neuroscience, we're going to find something. We're not going to look at use those categories. We're going to come up with our own category, our own, maybe even our own framework, and attempt to interact with meditation, neuroscience in that sort of a way. But on the other hand, there could be a sense, well, these are sacred, and I mean, let's face it, secret, hitherto secret categories. Who are you, scientists, to impose this sort of epistemology on these sacred categories, and maybe even to challenge certain aspects of those categorizations in terms of what you might find? So there's this kind of scope, right? So I'm curious about how you've navigated, I think it's very, very good, in fact, but how you've navigated this sort of bringing these categories from the textual and praxis tradition into this neuroscience context.
Yeah, that's the project. And I think that's what we're doing in the field more broadly. At least that's been my approach, is, I'm trained as a translator. My background, since I was a late teenager, in fact, my entire adult life was reading Tibetan text and studying with Tibetan lamas. I lived in Tibet for 3 years and trained in a monastery with my root teacher. And, whatever, the last 30 years of my life have been living with Tibetans, mostly in monastic settings. And I feel like we're at a moment here where those of us, and I invite Tawni into this conversation because she's very much my peer in this kind of life, where, we've been trained by Tibetans, by lamas, some of the most, frankly, extraordinary lineage holders on the planet. We've been trained by academics, my mentors in the academy have trained us to think critically and across disciplines and so forth. So we have this training that we have both from within the tradition, that's not looking from afar into the tradition, but it's actually from in the tradition. And then we have this other training of how do you make sense of that tradition? How do you critically evaluate it? How do you bring it to terms in contemplative parlance? How do you bring it to terms in the discourses that are dominant in our world, in our life, in our culture at this moment? Are those psychological? Are those cultural? Are those ecological? Are those political? Whatever they may be. And they are all of those most of the time. And my work, I've taken it in this direction because for a variety of reasons, but my work is first and foremost as a translator. That's what I've been trained to do. That's always what I've aspired to do. And, I started translating texts from Tibetan language into English and continued to do that. So there's the kind of lexical transfer kind of translation that we do. But then there's this other layer of translation, this kind of next dimension where we're saying, well, what is it not just to translate, this body of literature or this body of knowledge, even the living knowledge we receive from exemplars, but what is it to take that knowledge and to take that literature and to translate it into experience? What is it to translate it into practices that make sense in contemporary worlds for the people who speak the languages that we speak, who understand these kind of metaphors, who have a kind of lexicon, who have the kind of cultural context? What is it to do that? What kind of world conveyor do we need to be to go back and forth from world to world in order to do that? and it's not something that you just do overnight. It's a lifetime practice. And again, I invite my colleague Tawni to talk about this because her work and mine are so deeply resonant in this way. The only other thing I'll say here, and then I really invite Tawni, is that what this is not something new. So I think there's a real kind of well, I'm very skeptical, shall I say, of voices from outside the Tibetan tradition, or even inside, frankly, that are ahistorical, that are just saying, these practices are somehow homogeneous, and they're fixed in time, and they're eternal, and they're pristine. When we look at the historical record over the last 1,000 years, Tibetans starting to write in the late 10th, early 11th century, all the way up till now, we see an extraordinary, and I will say it again, an extraordinary variance in these practices. Tibetans experimented with how to perform these practices, dream yoga included, but we can go on and on across different families and styles of practices. How they're performed, where they're performed, the sequences in which they are performed, the modulations in which they are performed, the amplifications in which they are performed, the dosages in which they're performed. So all of these, the sequences, the temporalities or durations, the frequencies, these are the kind of features that, as researchers and scholars of these traditions, we think about seriously, we take seriously. And when we look at the historical record, the human contemplative record in Tibet, written by Tibetans, we see they were doing this same thing in their own way at their own time. Anyways, I have a lot to say about that, but I just want to really kind of with an exclamation mark say that Tibetans, in the Tibetan Buddhist contemplative tradition, as I understand it, is very much an experimental tradition and very deeply committed to understand what works for whom under what conditions. And if we are doing that in that same spirit, in conversation with that body of literature and with the living tradition, but also with empirical ways of knowing and philosophical ways of knowing and cultural ways of knowing, I think that's the best we can do to bring these traditions alive. Tawni, I know you're so deeply steeped in this too.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say, I just feel like a big part of this is that they're deeply community-based partnerships, right? That they are very much, at least in the work with the Tukdam project, so much of it, I mean, it was imagined by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right? Like he was the one that requested scientists to come and investigate the state of Tukdam, and through that process has been an enthusiasm and a curiosity of how do we do science together. And I remember that Geshe Tonila in one of our Zoom audiences with His Holiness asked His Holiness, how do we understand our own Buddhist education as well as our participation in research? And His Holiness said, it's pramana, right? It's a thema. You're actually looking at different instruments of knowledge and you're testing different instruments of knowledge. And that is your practice, to understand the basis of reality, to look at different states, to understand and investigate from different lenses. And I feel that our work really does have a deep partnership of looking at the dak and the zen, like the signs of how do you look at processes in the body, processes in the mind, how do you report that? How do you understand that from your internal experience, but also how does an external person look at that, measure that, examine that? And I think that we're creating that together as a field. And I think that's the most exciting part, is that a lot of this is not, I mean, Tukdam is not something that we would have ever come to as scientists to say, let us study. I mean, it's one of the most, precious moments of a practitioner's life, right? Is this transition from life to death, but to also realize that because of that, because this was an invited collaboration, an invited investigation that does draw on a long history within the Tibetan tradition itself, is that it's very creative. It has to be very creative. It has to be done in partnership, right? And because practitioners themselves are investigators of their own mind, right? This is the whole journey. So I think that's part of the inspiration of it as well.
Perhaps I can add one sentence to this idea of a secrecy, which I have dealt with for quite a while. I mean, not only in terms of the Tibetan culture, but also the textual culture that was there in India. So, and I think we can draw a line there, actual to sciences. Why is that? I mean, on the one hand, you can say if something were secret in the sense of don't reveal it, don't look at it, don't teach it, then it's of course slightly, let's say, not particularly intuitive that the largest body of text is tantric material. That's the one thing. On the other hand, what is it then that is secret about is probably the fact that it is, as you said, Tawni, to be practiced in collaboration, in partnership. And we can even say, or go so far as to say that perhaps a neuroscientist also has a certain sense of secrecy. Yeah, I mean, can I read the paper and understand it just like that, or do I need somebody to introduce me to it? Right, and in that sense, there is a lot of esoteric traditions out there which produce a big amount of literature, and I believe, and this is also one of the reasons that I found it nice to bring you two here to Steve, that we can try tackle in conversations some of the individual secrets that everybody carries who is a specialist in one field or the other, yeah, and to kind of get rid of these boundaries, right? And perhaps like after this tiny bit of a monologue about secrecy, a follow-up question, and that would be returning to the body, yeah, as one of the important things that has been re-evaluated by tantric traditions, the importance of the body and of any form of physiological experience, combined with the idea that there is a soteriological consideration behind tantra. How would you see, let's say, possible applications of these practices as you are both working towards secularizing them in a way that can be applied? Why I say this thing about the body? Well, I mean, for instance, bear with me for another sentence. For instance, thinking about yoga, which turned pretty much out into a well-being kind of machinery, and thinking about mindfulness that is mainly about, let's say, self-improvement, not in a particularly altruistic way, but rather the opposite way. So contributing to this idea of self-improvement, but without any form of soteriological sense behind that, not a lot of bodhicitta and aspiration, which you usually see, which on the other hand, the traditions always would claim is the key ingredient to success there. So, so thinking about these few elements combined, do you think that, or how would you try to integrate such possible thoughts? Because besides the secrecy, I think a main criticism is that secularizing practices will lead ultimately to their being diluted, yeah, in the sense that rendering them ineffectively, yeah, turning them into purely methods, right? And how would you tackle that? And I could imagine there is many people who would be interested in that. When I use that stuff that you produce, so how can I be sure that it is rendering my aspirations into a successful direction, right? And yeah, I stop here. Otherwise, it's getting too much. I have too many questions.
Michael, do you want to take that first?
I think that we're at a moment here in global culture where there's going to be a split in the road, and there will be two parallel trajectories. And one is a trajectory or kind of pathway for people who self-identify in a religious or contemplative tradition, and whatever kind of history and culture and tradition that has, they will stay aligned with it, and whatever that requires, whatever that requires. I think there's another trajectory that involves persons who are interested in transforming themselves for either well-being or spiritual purposes, that don't identify or self-identify as an adherent of one of those historical, culturally bound religious or contemplative traditions. And they instead understand that there's a kind of effective, skillful means that they can apply in their life to transform themselves, to enhance themselves in meaningful ways, to bring meaning in their life and purpose. And there'll be people who weave back and forth, according to their own agendas and so forth. But nonetheless, I do think that there's these two trajectories, and they're both completely fine in my mind, and I think they're already happening. This isn't like a prediction. I just think that they're going to continue along those parallel trajectories in more and more distinctive ways. I also think, we're at a moment here where these traditions that we're talking about, and it's not just the Tibetan or just the Buddhist, but really, if we're to take a global scan of contemplative traditions around the world, deep traditions in Africa. I have a colleague here who we're constantly learning from about African contemplative traditions in the Middle East. We just had this incredible conversations with Sufis and indigenous people of the Americas and so on and so forth around the world. People who have contemplative knowledge, people who have practices, they are in danger. They have been in danger for all of our lives, anyone on this call, that's for sure. And just reading the tea leaves of the global trends, there's not a lot of reprieve as far as I can see it. When we talk to, as Tawni alluded, some of the exemplars of these traditions, the wisdom holders, and they can speak for themselves. Those who are alive, I encourage you to talk with them, bring them on your podcasts. The message we're receiving from many Tibetans, the Dalai Lama being perhaps the most public and vocal because of his positionality, but we hear it from other lamas as well, at least I have, is let's also learn from these traditions and learn how they can enhance and transform people's lives. There's so much pain. There is so much pain in the world. to spend our time thinking, oh, this is Buddhist, or this is Christian, or this is Hindu, or this is not, is the old parable of having an arrow in the eye. We have too much pain in the world to really dilly-dally. And we have to, in my estimation, and again, this is in conversation with people I respect who are living exemplars, we have to mobilize the wisdom of these traditions and operationalize them through very practical, discrete means that are in conversation with our contemporary ways of living, our contemporary language, our contemporary technologies, our contemporary social context, etc. And that doesn't mean that we're sort of saying this isn't Buddhist, or this is more important, or this is less important, or this is for you and not for you, or all those kind of dichotomies, I think, are really artificial and extraordinarily time consuming. Instead, what we're saying is, how do we know what we know as researchers, as people who are trained in these traditions, from the textual histories, with living exemplars, with practitioners, with empirical methods, with phenomenological methods, etc., with all the tools at our disposal? How do we bring them to bear in this deeply collaborative, interdisciplinary research program to make sense, and again, translate these practices into effectual means to enhance people's lives and reduce suffering? And if we're not doing that, we can talk all day about, is it Buddhist or not, or are you secular, or what does it mean to be this or that? And frankly, a lot of people talk about that a lot. And I think we're at a point now where there's so many green lights from within and without that we're moving forward. And yes, there may be two trajectories, and may they both be paths of the alleviation of pain in the world.
I think, yeah, thanks for that. Despite my confused question, you seem to be very easily understood the direction that I wanted to take, because I was kind of hoping that it would go in this direction. And if I may be very frank, I think what we are doing is nothing else than has been done by the traditions themselves for centuries. Yeah, I mean, like, the Buddhism we have in Tibet is not the Buddhism we had in India, and what they were doing in India is also, like, elevating things, yeah, and not only stick with the patterns that somebody might have been grown up within. And we know all of this, yeah, everything went into all direction. So why not trying to be bold, as long as the motivation is in line with what seems to the basic aspirations of the traditions themselves? I think that's a very wise way to take, particularly because there is actually, frankly, not many other roads that you actually can take without running into one rabbit hole after the other. Yeah, where to begin and where to stop. Huh? Yeah, I think that's very good to understand also scholarship in that way.
I will also just kind of echo again Michael's point that we're in a very, very precious and fragile time, and that these great, great masters, these great, great adepts are passing, and that we see fewer and fewer of them. And at least in the context of Tukdam, these are those who have spent a life in retreat often that we have the opportunity to witness in Tukdam, that have done 3, 4, 5 3-year retreats in Tibet often, and then coming into India, although many have done it so in India as well. Many cases, obviously, in Tibet as well. And it's so interesting because in our audiences with His Holiness, we'll say, what is the benefit for the wider population. And he will say often that it's mostly just to investigate consciousness, to push neuroscientists about their assumptions about consciousness, right? But at least in my experience, when people get to see either by, the documentary or encounter a Tibetan case, it really changes their lives in many ways, right? To witness the capacity of our experience in this lifetime and across lifetimes. And even within our Tukdam team, the young monastic researchers who, are getting their Geshe degrees and are saturated with so many responsibilities and studies have started, at least in some of our units, to get up at 4 a.m. to start practicing, right? Because they're so inspired by their elders, by these senior masters. And to me, that's one of the most precious aspects of to see the possibility of what we're losing so quickly, right? And to be able to witness those who have invested the time and practice and effort to really become so accomplished in these remarkable practices is so precious, and we're losing that very quickly. And I think in science, when we have an n=1, n=2, right? And to see wow, my gosh, the age of the brain, right, is so much younger for someone who has spent a lifetime with these practices, right? And that our capacity to see and the nature of reality, to be compassionate at levels that we can't even imagine, is something that you can't witness without these remarkable individuals to engage with. And I think for at least in our work at the Center for Healthy Minds, we do have a lot of secularized practices and protocols. And one of the ones that's become well known is the Healthy Minds program, which, similar to MBSR and CBCT, really came from the inspiration of the tradition, right? But it's really taking these skills and to say, these will help people's lives. Building these skills will change people's ability to have greater happiness, greater well-being, greater connection with each other, greater insight into their experience and the nature of reality, purpose, right? These are life-saving skills, actually. It's not just distraction that is, eating our world alive, but the lack of purpose, loneliness, right? And so how can we establish that sense of connection, the sense of this common experience of all beings on this very fragile planet, to help at this vulnerable time? And these practices have been distilled in such a way that they can translate across different cultures, different communities. And one of our courses that's also co-taught at UVA and at Penn, that Art and Science of Human Flourishing, to help students to connect with all of these practices and the arts and the sciences, the art and science of understanding the research around well-being, the traditions that have gained insight. Part of what we did is do a whole series of different cultural practices that have these skills, right? From Peru to, the Middle East to Africa, and looking at how many cultures have these skills in their own practices, have these skills embedded in their community frameworks that are part of this long history, and how we can help people to reconnect with their own lineages, their own traditions, their own systems that are often just lost, right? That they can bring that into their experience, into their families and communities. So I think we have a lot of work to help people understand how much this is present in our world, if we can just reconnect with those practices and skills.
Wow.
Yeah, I love that. I just want to add, Steve, if I may, because
Of course.
Tawni really highlights and amplifies this in an important manner. I want to stress that these practices aren't arbitrary. There are logics embedded. There are fundamental building blocks and sequences and processes. There are contexts. There are understandable outcomes, etc., that are part of these practices. And I do think that there's a difference between what we're talking about now and some of what you will find on the spiritual marketplace. That is to say, there's all kinds of wildly invented practices out there. Go to your favorite YouTube channel and you'll find all kinds of things. There are people, frankly, making things up, and maybe they're saying it came from here or there or otherwise. Maybe they're not, and they're just saying this is going to change you for X, Y, and reason, and that's all different than what we're talking about. Okay, I think that's a really important distinction, in that what we're talking about is understanding these building blocks, understanding these processes, understanding these contexts, and reconstituting them, not adapting them, not saying, oh, what if we pluck it out of the Tibetan world and we stuff it in the American world? Or what if we take it from a monastery and plug it in a hospital? We're not, at least I'm not saying let's do that. I think there's all sorts of appropriation issues that are deeply, deeply troublesome, and the whole mindfulness movement has taught us a lesson, and the yoga movement has taught us a lesson in not doing that. Instead, I think what we're saying, and I think frankly what they're doing at Healthy Minds is very skillful in this too, is let's understand these traditions, these practices in a deep, integral manner, and from the bottom up. What are the skill sets and competencies that they are cultivating, and how are they going about doing that? And then let's work with that knowledge to reconstitute practices, to design practices that are effective in the contemporary populations and parlances and contexts. So I just want to point that out, because I think listeners may, those two things, I think, get blended easily unless they're pointed out.
And very similar, Michael, to the idea of what secrecy means. It is also, playing along these lines, like how do you perform practices, and how do they change and adapt according to the setting and circumstances that they are applied within, right? And both of these things, I also think it is really good to point that out to any potential listener, is not something that is against these traditions, but rather it seems to be aligned with what has been done throughout their development, at least as far as I can see them. And I think this is really a point that is good to make, right? Like you also see that you have in the Tibetan tradition all kinds of, let's say, practices, rituals of sorts that have been evolving simply as a result of a context that has been changed as these practices, changed their location, and they simply adapted, and that is actually the most natural thing to do. And as you say, the most important thing is that you understand what is their fundamentals. Understanding these fundamentals, then it doesn't matter so much if applications on the outlook might look different, as long as you can ensure they're going in the right direction. And you just make this point again, and we probably, all of us, we could go on for ages, like giving these kinds of examples, that to preserve something does not necessarily mean that these things do not change. All of these questions, secrecies, practices, traditions, there's several layers, and we have to think about, and probably this is the only thing that philologists is still good for, and sometimes in nowadays, to make to raise awareness about that these things matter, and these things matter, and it matters how we understand them. Sorry, please go ahead.
I want to just also affirm from the point of the tradition as well that you're saying, Julian. And I think as scholars who are also practitioners, we have an ethics that we abide by in the research too. And I think, at least for the Tukdom study, it's been really practice of navigating very skillfully around in our team of 65 team members from different schools, from different traditions, with the Russian Academy of Sciences, with our Indian neuroscience team, right? We don't talk about the details of practice that are secret, right? We don't even have in our team people who have read the practice, right? That they do not have the transmission, they do not have the lung, they do not have the empowerment, right? And so we have a way to work around that by looking at aspects of signs and looking at how do we understand the gestalt of the practice as maybe like a black box phenomena that we're looking at, but we don't get into even asking our practitioners or their attendants and families a lot of details about their practice. I mean, we might ask some about the completion stage practices, but often we aren't given those details, right? Because they are secret, or sometimes the attendants don't know a lot of those details about their own teachers, right? So we work around all those aspects of samaya and secrecy through doing research where we prioritize what is the overall aim of the research, what is the methods that we're looking at, and how do we then achieve those without compromising those aspects of the research as well, and of the practitioners in our community.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. That was quite a remarkable conversation. I'm very much looking forward to the sequel, which we will record shortly and will be released shortly after people are seeing this. And that's to do with death and dying. And Tawni, for that, at least at the very beginning, you'll be on the hot seat to tell us all about the work you've been doing in that area. And then, of course, as we've done here, it'll open up to this sort of discussion. We can continue these themes and explore new ones as well. So thank you, all three of you, for your time and for engaging in this conversation and for all that you're doing. Michael Sheehy, Tawni Tidwell, and Julian Schott, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.